Hello, everyone.
Hello,
Welcome in the former ISA President's session and about the history this time of ISA and its 20th century, 20 Congress of Sociology. So let me start. On behalf of everyone gathered, I pay respect to the spirit of country here in Narem, where we are meeting. I acknowledge the past and the present, Kulin Nation, Wurundjeri, Wurrung, as the sovereign people here, the cultural knowledge holders who maintain and promote the normed Aboriginal law, customs, and custodianship responsibilities for country and the people that country continue to sustain generation after generation into the future for all of us. I recognize the important contribution that First Nations thinkers have made to sociology, including challenges to our dominant way of thinking. We thank all First Nations delegates in the room today for their contributions to knowledge in the discipline. So, as you know, we are celebrating, this is the 20th Congress, World Congress of Sociology. So to highlight that and part of my presidential project, I ask Gisèle Sapiro to look to the history of ISA through its research councils, or at least a specific research council. And I ask Tom Dwyer to look to ISA history from the point of view of national associations, and particularly to complement what Jennifer Platt did her book, History of ISA 1948-1997, which is, by the way, online in our website. So I am so honored to chair this session. We will give Gisèle Sapiro and Tom Dwyer, each of them 25 minutes, and then our dear former president, 10 minutes to TK Omen, and 10 minutes for Alberto Martellini, and 10 minutes for Pietro Stamka, and 10 minutes for Michael Barawi, and 10 minutes for Margaret Abraham. So this is, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So, hello, Gisèle, are you with us?
I am with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the problem is that I hear myself.
So go ahead.
Okay. So I want first to apologize for not being with you in person. And second, I would like to thank Sari for inviting me to write this research. This study complements Jennifer Platt's brief history of the ISA, from which I learned a lot. I focus on the congresses as asked by Sari. The study is also based on the newsletter, on interviews with former presidents and one vice president, whom I would like all to thank very much for their time, and also on archive, which I thank Isabella Barlinska and the Secretariat for providing me with during the pandemics. I'd like also to thank Alihan Metsky, who updated the data since 1994, as well as Thibault Boncourt, who wrote a brief and tangled socio-history of RC 18, 47 and 48, which is included in the appendix. In this study, I argued that the ISA, founded in 1949 at the initiative of the UNESCO, has played a major role in both the institutionalization of sociology as a discipline and in its internationalization. Histories of the discipline overlook the international circulation of the disciplinary model and its role in the national institutionalization of the discipline. They also tend to conflate four often related yet distinct processes that did not converge until the post-war period, the emergence of a scientific field, the academic institutionalization of a discipline, the professional development of an intellectual activity, and the rise of a specialized publishing market. So scientific development can be observed with the emergence of what Thomas Kuhn calls a disciplinary matrix and the autonomization of a scientific field, which is defined following Pierre Bourdieu by a specific object, specific problems and tools, and a competition ruled by specific authorities such as scientific journals and learned societies. This process is attested by the emergence of journals dedicated to this field, for instance, Revue Internationale de Sociologie in 1893, Revista di Sociologia in 1894, the Sociological Review in 1908, and learned societies such as the Société de Sociologie de Paris 1895 and the Sociological Society in 1903. The ISA and its journal Current Sociology was starting in 1950, a major site of transnational circulation of knowledge among peers and fostered the formation of an international sociological field. It was supplemented in 1986 by international sociology. Academic institutionalization is understood here as the institutional development of disciplines within the academic system with the creation of curricula, faculty positions, and diplomas. It may precede the formation of a scientific field, like in the case of legal studies, although the model of the Humboldt University combining teaching and research circulated across the world in the first half of the 20th century, the convergence was not automatic. Apart from the United States and Japan, it was not until the 1950s, 60s, that sociology achieved full academic institutionalization in most countries. There are also cases, of course, of disinstitutionalization as sociology experienced under the communist regimes and under other authoritarian regimes. The ISA contributed to the convergence of scientific development and academic institutionalization of sociology. The ISA also contributed to its professional development, to use Andrew Abbott's term, a process characterized by the advent of professional organizations such as associations, which defend the interests of the profession, but also play a regulatory role in defining a professional ethics. This process is not necessarily related to academic institutionalization, as the case of psychoanalysis shows. Sociology was first institutionalized in the United States to train social workers, but social work was at some point excluded from the discipline as it organized itself as a profession. One can observe that the organizational model which prevailed up to the Second World War was that of learned societies based on cooptation, and it moved after the war to association based on voluntary membership and meetings combining scientific and professional questions following the model promoted by the ISA. For instance, American Sociological Society was renamed Association in 1959. So the national seems here to follow the international model. The fourth factor of development of sociology and more broadly the human and social sciences is the rise of a specialized publishing market. The interest of publishers in scholarly works arose in the first half of the century in close relation to the development of higher education, academic presses in the US, more scholarly publishers in Europe. In the 1950s, large trade publishers became also interested in the social and human sciences. And the ISA again contributed to this subfield by publishing the proceedings of the congresses, the transactions, and they were replaced in 1974 by a book series with Sage. So now let me present 3 periods of the history of the ISA, because despite institutional continuity, the ISA has significantly evolved since its foundation, not only in its morphology, but also in its inner organization and in its functions, the functions it fulfills in the transnational field of sociology. So the first period founded as a consultative body of the UNESCO, the ISA initially aimed to provide evidence for its political agenda, which included the pacification of international relations, the promotion of democracy against authoritarian trends, the West-East dialogue, and social planning. It was during this first period, spanning from 1949 to 1970, that the ISA most contributed to the academic institutionalization and professionalization of sociology through the forementioned processes. The ISA helped sociology establish sociology as an academic discipline in collaboration with the UNESCO and to structure an international sociological field. Professional norms, teaching standards, and research methods were discussed and circulated in the congresses. The ISA collaborated with UNESCO on studies about the teaching of sociology in 15 countries that were published in the UNESCO series, Teaching in the Social Sciences. As an international association, the ISA also played a role in the professional development of sociology by supporting the foundation of national associations, which would join the ISA as regular members. The ISA encouraged national initiatives, tried to contact sociologists in countries that were not affiliated with it, and helped them establish the discipline in the country. How international was the ISA? In 1950, the ISA had 29 regular members and 6 associate members, plus some qualified individual members. 39 countries were represented. In 1959, the number of collective members had rose to 66 plus 4 associates, and 58 countries were represented. However, during the first decade, the European participation in the congresses was dominant. As you can see from the percentage per region in the 1959 Congress in Stresa. The share of Eastern European rose thanks to the TOE. American scholars were still reluctant to take part in the congresses. This changed in 1962 when with the 5th Congress in Washington. It was the first out of Europe. The Congress was held in partnership with ASA, American Sociological Association, and the common session was organized on the sociologists, the policymaker, and the public. The share of North American participants rose from 16% in Stresa to 59% in Washington. The number of Canadian scholars was also multiplied per 10. The impact of the location of the Congress on the participation of sociologists from the region is observed to date. In Evian, 1966, the number of participants reached 2,000, twice as much as in Washington, and they came from 40 countries. During this first period, the ISA set up a research agenda built on large-scale international comparisons in collaboration with UNESCO, namely the comparative research on social stratification launched by Theodor Geiger. This agenda was in large part determined by the demand for expertise from the UNESCO on burning issues as attested by the Congress themes, international relations and intergroup conflicts, development. Other timely topics were discussed in the congresses, such as social conflicts, migration, displaced persons, youth, assimilation, racism, and so on. While combating fascism and authoritarian tendencies, the UNESCO was implicated in the Cold War by promoting Western social sciences modeled after American positivism against Marxism. These ideological struggles were reflected in the ISA. The UNESCO was also interested in triggering a dialogue with the scholars in socialist countries where sociology had been forbidden as a bourgeois science. The confrontation between Marxist and non-Marxist scholars culminated in 1970 in the 1970 Congress in Varna. By that time, this cleavage no longer coincided with the geopolitical divisions, as the participation of Marxist scholars from the West had grown, reflecting the politicization of the discipline in the 1960s and the rise of an opposition to the dominant positivist paradigm. The ISA became a site of confrontation between structural functionalism and Marxism, namely around the question of historicity, but it was also a place of dialogue around comparative analysis, planning, and quantitative methods and models. However, both positivist and Marxist paradigms were soon challenged by critics about their applicability to other cultural realities and by new approaches that became visible in the next period. In addition to structuring an international sociological field, the ISA contributed to the emergence of a transnational subfield of publishing specialized in social science with the support of the UNESCO. Current Sociology published trend reports on different topics such as urban sociology, industrial and rural sociology, assimilation of immigrants, electoral sociology, the sociology of family, religion, criminology, and so on. The proceedings of the congresses, which included surveys on recent research trends in different countries, training and professional issues, asserted the discipline as such in the international academic field at a crucial point of its professionalization and academic institutionalization. Despite the presence of non-Western members from the start, the association had remained during the first period under Western domination, and there was hardly any female sociologists in the governing boards or in the plenaries. In 1972, the ISA was composed of 47 national associations. Although the European continent was best represented, other regions of the world started joining. The decision taken during the Varna Congress to open the association to individual membership had indeed a huge impact on the association beyond the numeral growth of individual members, which rose from 29 in 1966 to 1,000 in 1978 and 2,700 in 1990. So the impact was threefold. First, at the morphological level, it started the process of geographic diversification and of feminization. Second, it freed the ISA from its dependence upon the UNESCO and external sources of funding. Third, it fostered the proliferation of the RCs, which reflected the specialization of subdisciplinary fields and triggered the construction of transnational networks. There were 17 active RCs in 1970, 48 in 1989. In the second phase of its existence, spanning from 1971 to 1990, the ISA thus contributed to the specialization and the transnationalization of research through its RCs, which gained autonomy from the Council and Executive Committee. This double structure of an international organization on one hand and a hub of transnational research networks on the other created a productive tension within the association. Although the new RCs were more research than policy-oriented, some of them were still dependent on the social demand for expertise. Organization, self-management, aging, youth, deviance, agriculture, and food were topics of high interest for policymakers. The social ecology RC worked in close connection with the UNESCO's program on ecological indicator of social change. Planning and futurology was a matter of confrontation between Marxist and non-Marxist sociologists. The Marxists opposed the paradigm of post-industrial society, which prevailed in US sociology. The concept of lifestyle became nevertheless a common ground for comparison across countries. The sociology of work was also a domain of ideological confrontation. While mathematical and statistical methods were by that time well established, new methods were introduced, especially network analysis and biography. Comparative sociology was institutionalized as an RC in 1986. It is telling that international comparison, which had been the major objective of the ISA in the first period, had become an RC among others. In the 1980s, comparison started being challenged by the study of circulation and flows, but the notion of transnational does not appear in the titles of plenary papers until 1990. The congresses took this during this second period the form we know with plenaries and semi-plenaries and RC meetings. The two congresses organized in the 1980s in Mexico and in New Delhi raised the participation from non-Western regions. In Mexico, for the first time, a sociologist from the Global South, the Brazilian Fernando Cardoso, was elected as president. In 1990, the election of Indian sociologist T.K. Oman, who is with us today, inaugurated a new era. These transformations were reflected in both the morphology of the ISA and the intellectual debates in the congresses starting in the 1980s. The feminization of the discipline also transformed the ISA's morphology. Late Margaret Archer was elected first female president in 1986. but women were hardly present in RC boards, except for women in society, and in the plenaries, it was less than 10% in the 1980s. This situation would evolve in the next period. The third period was marked by the reconfiguration of geopolitical relations after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Many newly independent countries joined. The number of regular collective members grew from 45 in 1994 to 74 in 2021. The association experienced a new phase of growth and a diversification of the geographic origins of its members. Individual membership increased from 3,500 in 1994 to more than 6,000 in 2018. Membership was stabilized by the decision to fix the term of adhesion to 4 years. The inclusion of sociologists from underprivileged countries was triggered by the adoption of 3 graduate categories of fees. In the 1990s, the morphology of membership was marked by the rise in the number of East European and Asian sociologists. As said, the location of the Congress is strategic. The choice of Durban in 2006 enabled more African sociologists to participate in the World Congress, while in Yokohama 2014, the share of East Asian scholars reached 26%. You can observe the impact of the geographic distribution of membership, the stabilization of Sub-Saharan and East Asian share after these 2 congresses. The ISA thus helped structure a global sociological field less nationally organized and less dominated by the West. The increasing participation of non-Western sociologists entailed, however, a contestation of the Western domination. Similarly, the feminization of the ISA was not reflected in the governing board nor in the plenaries, sparking protest from feminist members. Despite a growing awareness, the reflection led within the governing boards on the means to reduce inequalities were very slow to produce their effects, since the obstacles were not only economic nor political or infrastructural, but also cultural and cognitive, as revealed by the basic counting I did of the invited speakers to the plenaries, author sessions, and nominations for prizes. So these were 2 innovations of that period. Nevertheless, you can see that the executive committee became more diverse in terms of geographic origins. It has been said that the presence of Global South scholars could counter the feminization of the plenary sessions, but this assertion is inaccurate. The share of women among participants from the Philippines is much beyond the average, 71% in 2014 and 63% in 2018. And it was 68% for Indonesia at the Yokohama Congress. Moreover, there are very active female sociologists from Brazil, India, and the Philippines, for instance, who played a role in the feminization of the plenaries, as well as in the inclusion of Global South scholars. Measures were also taken in favor of linguistic inclusiveness, the adoption of Spanish as third language with English and French, sessions of language communities, translation of global dialogues in many languages, use of multilingualism in the oral presentation with the help of PowerPoints. So these measures proved efficient, but they operate at the margin of the main sessions. And in Porto Alegre, also the automatic translation was tested. So this third period has been marked by the emergence of new epistemological challenges from feminist theory and indigenous perspectives, as the symposia sessions demonstrate. They followed and countered the institutionalization of rational choice theory. Additional challenges came from other disciplines, such as environmental studies and cybernetics. Traditional objects of study, such as work, migration, health, and inequalities, were also challenged by the globalization of trade and finance, neoliberal policies, and the mass displacement of populations. Political sociology has to address new forms of collective identities, which challenge the nation states and the rise of illiberal and authoritarian regimes. The concept of power achieved a more critical function. Social classes maintained their relevance, but were increasingly combined in intersectional approaches with ethnicity and gender. Technology started being considered in itself as a social force, impacting other domains such as health, information, and of course, communication with the new technologies and social media. The interest in social movements translated in the creation of two RCs, one in the line of late Alain Touraine and one in the line of Charles Tilly's theory of collective action. Other new research fields of objects that emerged in the 1990s were tourism, childhood, housing, and the body. Animals were devoted an ad hoc session at the 2018 Congress, but don't seem to have become as prevalent as in other disciplines. In 2006, human rights and risk were each devoted a thematic group. After 2010, new thematic groups were created on senses, emotions, and violence. Violence had been a recurrent theme in plenaries since 1998 and featured in 2018 Congress theme dealing not only with individual but also with state violence confronted with the strive to social justice. Methodology and approaches were also renewed with groups focusing on social indicators, on historical sociology, on local global relations, on visual sociology, on institutional ethnography, and on digital sociology. The transnational approach first appeared through specific objects, transnational communities in relation to migration, transnational corporations, and later as an approach for which a methodology needs to be established. The center-periphery divide continued to prove its heuristic value, enforced by the role Immanuel Wallerstein played in the ISA as president, but this scheme was complicated by the Western, non-Western, and North-South divide. Non-Western thought and epistemologies became an issue, and an ad hoc session was dedicated to Ibn Khaldun's contribution to sociology in the 2006 Congress. The growing specialization attested by the proliferation of RCs, which reached 57 in 1994, presented the risk of a balkanization of the discipline. The number was reduced to 53 in 1998. To conclude, the disciplinary and professional norms disseminated by the ISA, which contributed to shape the discipline, were in large part informed by the American model. However, the universalist imperialism of the ISA encountered resistance in its desire of expansion, which contributed to undermine it. Starting in 1966, after the thaw, it had become a site of confrontation and exchange between the dominant US theories and various forms of Marxism, orthodox and heterodox. Starting in the 1980s, it was challenged by feminist and indigenous perspectives, among others. There was also network theories and others. So the history of the ISA reveals that internationalization, regionalization, transnationalization, and globalization are distinct processes which can enter in tension. The international logics triggered the formation of national sociological fields in many countries, while the RCs fostered the formation of transnational networks. While internationalization had been in the first phase of the ISA's existence a vector of imposition of professional norms supporting Western hegemony, it has become a force of opposition to Western domination. Thanks for attention.
Thank you so much. Hello? Thank you so much, Gisèle. This is extremely helpful to understand this development, and I found it amazing how we progress in gender equality. I mean, in ISA, among many amazing insights. Sorry. Now, I forgot to say, Gisèle is professor of sociology at l'École des études en sciences sociales in Paris, and she is a research director of the Center, European Center for Sociology and Political Science. Now I give the floor to Tom Dwyer, who is a professor of sociology at UNICAM in São Paulo, but also he is co-director of the Center CAS and UNICAM. It's a joint between China and Brazil about China studies. So you have the floor, Tom.
afternoon, everyone. I've just got a little biographical note to put in this. As you're probably realising, especially the Australians, I don't sound like an Australian, but somewhere close by. Yeah, I was born in New Zealand. And my first job as an assistant professor was at ANU. So that was just 6 months before I went to Paris to do my doctorate with the late Alan Terrain. So it's kind of an interesting return after so many years to be back here, and I've now been 40 years in Brazil. I'm just looking for to get the time on my watch so as I don't go too much over time. So yeah, that was a really interesting start way back then. It was 1976, to tell you the truth. So let me just put this on. Yeah, okay. So my story's here with ISA. It started as probably, it's happening to a number of you today, coming to an ISA conference in Madrid. And I thought it was just incredible. Really, what a lively thing, and all of these students from all around the world, and everybody talking, and you making friends and talking about your research and stuff. And it just, it really blew me out. Even though I'd been a doctoral student in Paris and things, I'd never, ever had an experience like that. And it took me as a bit of a surprise when Sari invited me to do this particular thing and this particular work. And even though I've been involved in national associations, I took on a wider brief because I knew Gisèle was going to do something like this that she did, but I didn't realize how she'd go back so far and things. And so I thought, well, I'll just update Jennifer Platt in the other areas which Gisèle is not working in. But you have to go back to the beginning to get into some things and work out where you are. So why was ISA founded? And when it was founded, it was to stop war. A bit like Europe. Europe was founded to stop war. And it was, through this idea of cooperation between sciences, we could move ahead and just raise levels of knowledge. So it had a kind of rationalist perspective and stuff in all various areas of inquiry. And we're talking about political science, law, economics at that stage. So I think this mission is something that it's very interesting. I've interviewed all the ex-ISA presidents. I've interviewed many board members to try and get a handle on these things. I spent a week in Madrid where I basically got all of the archives about all of the meetings over the last 25 years. And I'm interested, basically, I was trained as a sociologist of work, but organizations more so. So I'm really interested in how the organization got together, what were the conflicts that it had in it when it, as it moved forward, and what kinds of tensions these reflected, as reflected in minutes and then eventually in the interviews. And when I was in the Madrid office, I'd never been there, 40 square meters and running the world sociology from this tiny little office with one staff member full-time and 3 part-time staff members. And I remember being there, getting onto the American sociological site and seeing that with something like the double of members, a little bit below that of ISA, it had 22 staff members. And I thought, this is pretty special. And then as I was there during the days looking up the stuff and getting everything organized, I then realized how important tacit knowledge is in that organization. Things that are, because you're dealing with cultures that come all over the place, and you need an incredible amount of tact and leeway to work with such a complex organization and being so small. So that was the very thing. And how did ISA office get to Madrid? Basically, it was a real mess. It was going, oops, hang on, that's not up on the, oh yeah, wait a moment, I'm a bit lost here. This was the particular situation of all the directorships and the various places it would be. I've been all around been to Montreal, Amsterdam, going backwards and forwards with various directors. And so it had 18 of them in a period of about 30 years, 37 years, at 18 different places. So it was a real mess, and quite often they were going after money to do this, moving backwards and forwards, because different governments would give them money, etc., to get there. And then there was a bit of cloak and dagger stuff, as Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was president of ISA at the time, was in Madrid, and he went and met Felipe González at the day that there was the NATO referendum, and they met up quickly, and Felipe González, I guess, signed a check and gave him a headquarters, and that was how ISA started off in Spain. And then Margaret Archer in Journeys Through Sociology is interesting when she talks about the setting up of the office with Isabella. And today, basically, ISA headquarters, we have a tiny organization with a big role. And I really think this is a sort of dangerous situation, because the amount of tacit knowledge that is used to run that place day by day is quite extraordinary. I mean, I wasn't even there to gather it. I just picked it up as I was going along. So that was an intractable, what we see here is an intractable problem. Where the hell is ISA headquarters going to be? And it got resolved. So it's been there since 1987, so that's a hell of a long time. And it was a real intractable problem. And there was one other intractable problem. These, by the way, are our presidents. This is just who we're talking about. And I put on the side who they were against in the second round, if there was a second round, just because, you know, the ISA, when you interview people, they always mention two groups, you know, and that the presidents come out of one of these other groups. I'd never really thought of it like that, to tell you the truth. But that's what they say, so therefore I had to put that in. But that's who we're talking about, our presidents. Wallerstein was 1 year, or less than a year if you take it. And Sari, of course, just goes a bit overtime because of the pandemic. So the other intractable problem, and I thought that was in the previous slide, but it's that slide. No, it's in that. Yeah, these were the two intractable problems: the Secretariat and insufficient funding, and the organisation having nearly gone bankrupt on a number of occasions. That's in Jennifer Platt's history. And so you keep moving forward a bit here. Basically, how on earth do you raise income? And this was a huge problem. And in Stomka's mandate, basically it was this, it was explained in the minutes, this very vigorous discussion, so you can imagine what it was, and it counterposed two views of capitalism. One was what we call in Brazil crony capitalism, or maybe, and the other one was kind of real rational capitalism, a European view of who should ISA publish with, and an American view, if we want to say, free market and all that stuff. And that ended up with essentially a competition being opened up, where the then current publisher raised, because it was competitive with other editors, raised really the offers and improved the package quite a lot. And that has put ISA on what is necessary for any organisation, a sound financial footing. T.K. Oman will certainly talk about that time, and you can see the stuff in his thing about he was going around with his with a cap. You know, he was looking for money everywhere and he couldn't find it. And there were many cost reductions made and also other measures, but these measures were made to raise income from Stomka's time, and some of them come from Martinelli's and some from Wallerstein's time. The one that was most lucked out was the one on publications, but others were putting on 4-year budgets and questions like that sound quite technical and boring, and they probably are for most people. But if we forget about finances in any organisation, you know, we're in real problems, unless we're, of course, born millionaires or something, you know. But I suspect millionaires never forget about finances. So I just want to point that out. I just think that I served on Finance and Membership Committee as well, and I, you know, really understood that that was a non-understood part of the ISA at that time. So there we go. And then the COVID actually helped ISA finances quite a lot. No congresses to run, no people getting planes all around the world. And so this was kind of an unimagined consequence of it. And a solidarity fund was approved with that to do two things: young scholars, and to bring in people, registration grants for B and C countries. And then there was an extra year's ISA membership fee. And it was very interesting. The finance and management VP, she was always saying from the beginning that the money accumulated, we must make sure this money gets back to our members somehow. So this was a solution done. So for those of you who don't know ISA, it's very impressive really, you start reading it, the minutes and things, that these ideas about paying special attention to the B and C category countries. This is World Bank categorization. A are the richest ones, B are the middle ones, and C are the poor ones. And this is always a reference in the meetings and any decisions taken. That thing is, well, what does this mean in terms of the poorer countries? So let's just go on to some aggregated statistics. I know you're dying to see this. This is essentially the forum and participation over the period. You can see essentially that ISA membership from Montreal, it basically doubles by Toronto, and then it slumps with the pandemic, and congresses are also going up. The small bars for the congresses should be somewhere else because they're forums. They should be yellow or something because they're forums and they're not really congresses to that extent. So, and what we see then the following year, I was worried about this, that, okay, and it was in the minutes again of the finance and management, are we going to have a problem with COVID and loss of members? And here it checked out last month and we were back up to close to 6,000 members, 5,000. So, you know, none of you need to worry, the students and things here, that ISA is going to disappear tomorrow. Okay, so that's the first piece of good news. And this first graph shows individual meeting doubling, and then the Melbourne conference basically brings it back to where we're going. And Congress and forum participation, this idea, ABC countries, which I've already introduced. You see, I'm not such an organized speaker as Gisèle is. But here we see essentially that blue line is the A countries, and it's always above 60% and quite often above 80% of conference attendees. One exception, and you can see it there, is Buenos Aires Forum, and that was an interesting conference because it had two linguistic trains basically. One was in Spanish and the other was in English, and it was a regional conference all mixed up with an international conference, and this brought in a lot of Latin Americans for their first international experience. So that was interesting. And then, as Gisèle mentioned, also Durban and Barcelona, but she didn't mention that, were congresses that brought in a lot of people from B and C countries. So I think that kind of gives us an idea that if we do conferences in the future in countries like that, Durban, such as South Africa, that was really important, C country participation. And that is perhaps a way of actually internationalizing. There is a problem. Michael Baroy did a blue ribbon committee when he was president. And this is the other thing about IN, it's a thinking and it's an intelligent organization. Always, what are the consequences of that? And one of the big problems is it's really expensive to do a conference in a place like this. And I've been through the books, you know, and you can see that ISA doesn't make money and quite often loses money with these things. And, you know, and this is for all of the efforts it makes. It's quite extraordinary. I always thought it was you know, I mean, in Brazilian, I was president of Brazilian Sociological Society. We used conferences to get our money going. You know, that was where we got our money from. It wasn't from membership fees. No, it was imagined ISA was that, but the reality is not that. These are very expensive venues, and we're not doctors, you know, we don't pay these high fees and stuff. So just to, yeah, that's what I wanted to say there. I better keep looking at the time because otherwise I'll get cut off, and I've got a little bit behind now. So wait a minute. Yeah, and the thing Jennifer Platt basically made a formula in the first 50 years that geography had a tight relationship with attendance, and that's what we've just seen for Durban, etc., Buenos Aires. And I think Barcelona must be interesting because a lot of people must have been able to come across the Mediterranean in boats and things like that. I'm imagining, I haven't looked at I should have looked at the individual data on that from where the countries came, but I think that's an important policy type question. Individual membership by regions, the grey is the European Union, the blue is North America, and the big riser there is East Asia and the Pacific. Now, you can see a very sharp drop-off in 2018 in Europe. That's simply because of Brexit. The United Kingdom had about 5% of all ISA members. They're now in rest of Europe and Central Asia, okay? It's nothing to do with Europe getting disenchanted with the ISA, but, and so that means that there's a jump in that, and an orangey line, rest of Europe, of about 381 it was at the end, people. So that, you know, we've got sort of healthy regional growth moving on. Individual growth by the regions, okay, I've done that. This is, I think, an interesting sort of a graph that I did, which is the beginning of the period and the end of the period. I didn't put 2022 because it's absolutely an anomaly, as that first table I presented showed you. So essentially we see this much more colourful, the graph. There's one block of power, which was one block of members, which was Europe has declined, but you've got to remember that 5% of that, of the whole membership, was in that block, so it hasn't declined all that much. Asia has increased quite considerably, and that's what we're seeing. Now, where is the growth occurring? East Asia and Pacific, 10% of ISA members in that earlier period to 16%. Then South Asia from 3 to 8%. That's India. India is 90% of South Asia membership. And Sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the kind of three areas that I would think, if I were an ISA policymaker, that I would concentrate on for thinking about the future. And I didn't write it as a kind of policy paper or not. These are just things that occurred to you as you went along reading it. And then, so maybe the future. Membership in Southeast Asia and South Asia is interesting because in East Asia, it's Japan is basically the big one. And you folks in Australia, you pack a big punch for 26 million people. You've got, you know, it's 21% of the region's members today, and you're about the same population as Taiwan, and it's 26%, so it's a lot of sociologists for a small population. That's kind of interesting. And then the anomalies in this area are interesting. Indonesia, you know, the biggest Islamic country in the world, what's the 5th biggest country in the world by population, or 4th? It's never been affiliated to ISA, 4% of the region's members. China, 1.4 billion people, not a member of the ISA, never accounted for more than 7% of the region's members. Very small number of Congress goers. There are some. I was on a round table in the next building just before the president of the Chinese Sociological Association. In Taiwan, population of 24 million. Absolutely, their sociological society is really impressive, really is. And never, you know, never accounted for more than 6.5% of the growth. So what do we then come up here? We come to the question of China. And I mentioned those intractable problems like the Secretariat and Finance, and both of them got resolved. And I hope that this has been, I mean, Michael Burawa is here. I talked to Martinelli, talked to Vivorka, and I've read all the minutes, and everybody has been involved in trying to get China into ISA. And TSA basically wants that particular vote, which we'll use tonight. And if they were to become an affiliated collective member rather than a regular, that would be able to be resolved. And Stomka, as others, many said in their interviews to me about what a pity it was that China wasn't a member. And this I didn't even ask them, not mainly, you know. I always sense scholars from Beijing and Shanghai are really well-trained sociologists with very solid sociological education. The effort to get China should be done very definitely. And I think that China actually being outside, and now the sabers are being rattled, that is, we're actually, by not getting China in, we're not going, I won't say disobeying, but we're not respecting that original mandate that UNESCO put up for us. I mean, I really do think that China's absence in ISA is a big problem. I hope Japanese and Korean friends and things are working quite closely with China. So in many areas right now, as are Taiwanese, by the way, even though right now it's a bit more difficult. So that particular question, I hope will be resolved, but I really think, you know, that it is something that we must pay a lot of attention to and take it probably as a long-term issue, you know, step by step, how do we get through this? And then gender balance, Gisèle talked about this. We've got all sorts of statistics these days with Congress. When we lost the Congress company that did Gothenburg, we lost a lot of the statistics. So they're not, we can't go back to gender and stuff like that prior to Gothenburg. But the last Congresses, we've all had a minimum of 52% women at Yokohama and a maximum of 58% at Toronto. So they've been feminine, really important. And I'm going to show two graphs. That's the one it looks like, but I've got my student to do this, which shows it much more clearly how when Maggie Abrahams, who's just sitting down here, was elected president. That's the crossover when suddenly the executive committee gets a lot more women members than male members. So that's a real crossover that's already been addressed. And we'll just go back. And ISA has had some initiatives in this area. I mean, you know, gender again is a preoccupation within the board meetings and stuff like that. And also the PhD labs, they do look at, you know, it's excellence first and then there's agenda and B and C country preference for getting that in. So there is some policy in place, but it doesn't seem to be that much policy for gender. Oops, just hang on. Oh. Sorry, I'm just trying to control my time and it's taking time to control the time. So any case, so we'll keep going. And then the origins of executive, I mean, when you look at the graph, that orange there is European Union and grey is North America. And look at how it just evolves over time. You know, right now, I mean, the Sub-Saharan Africa and rest of Europe and Central Asia are way down there, I guess, with the United Kingdom now being in Central Europe and in Central Asia and the rest of Europe, it will grow quite considerably, the membership of Ecole. But it's certainly a much more equilibrated regionally than it was before, and that's just the sort of a tendency of that. Then we come to another intractable question, language. Heaven's sake, look, I mean, I've seen fights in ISA, which has led to people getting up and walking out of meeting because of language. You know, there's anyone who thinks, oh, English can be used easily. I mean, I'm sorry, if you're only monolingual, you have got no idea about what another language is and the difficulty and things like that. I'm speaking in my native tongue right now. I'm very fortunate to be fluent in three languages. But what I've noticed in this particular group of presidents, they're all multilingual of the last 25 years, all of them. That's pretty interesting. And of this particular Exco, just where they come from, they at least speak English in their native language, and there's a lot of them in that particular thing. And then we have a really, really interesting development. I mean, I don't know how interesting he thought of it when he did it, but global dialogue is translated, I counted them up, is in 18 languages. That seems to me to be a future for expanding ISA and thinking, but we should probably do some research on its reach and audience research. But that is a kind of, we assume that there's a Tower of Babel, and we work with it, sort of in its own terms. That seems to me. And there was, Gisèle again mentioned, this is the kind of technological fix at Porto Alegre, which was getting subtitles and translations of subtitles. And yeah, that was pretty good, but that's not really linguistic pluralism. And then the Buenos Aires thing. I've got to rush now. The increased sensitivity to the linguistic questions there. Then there's a Frenchman who wrote to Sari, I guess, saying that, you know, when you think about things in different languages, that those words have different meanings, and this can be state, this can be nation, it can be all sorts of things, and that is exactly what we're talking about, you know. So we really must try and work out some kind of solution to the thing. Information technology, it runs right through the whole ISA effort in these last years. Incredible, I mentioned Buru again, Digital Worlds, Maggie Abrahams in Buenos Aires, launching sites. It's everywhere, but it started right in the 80s in Amsterdam as a computer, you know, at a computer, and then it just grew and Wallerstein brought it in. It's very interesting. The Americans were much more, the American presidents were much more tuned into IT than others. And then I went through a few of these things because I passed out what I was doing to people and said, oh, you must mention such and such things. Well, Publications Committee, I just put it in, I was going to talk about it, but I'm running out of time, so you've got to click through fast. Research committees, Gisèle has done that, I mentioned that. One of the interesting things about research committees, since 2002, they've been trying to reform the statutes, and they can't. They can't get everyone to obey it, you know. And that's really interesting. That's another intractable problem. Maybe it's a good problem. You know, I mean, some of these intractable problems, because there's logics and things, you know, we all want to avoid the iron law of oligarchy where someone perpetuates himself in a research committee, but eventually everyone in the research committee may want a friendly dictator, you know. I mean, that is a kind of an option, perhaps. I don't know how far we push democratization. There was a piece of deinstitutionalization. Look, I'm trying to look at institutional history, which was the vice president for programs was abolished, and that has certainly changed the way that congresses have been organized because it's more in-house now than it was in those days. And here we come to what the vice presidency for national associations was approved in the Council of Assemblies of 2002, brought up in Wallerstein's time, approved in 2002, implemented implanted during Stobke's mandate. That's the figures. The black bars are essentially the national associations. They keep growing, and the affiliated collective members of the grey bars. The national associations have risen from 54 to 73. And one thing this has ended up doing is presidential diplomacy has become a term that you can use. Both Michael and Maggie traveled just so much. Obviously, Sari couldn't because of the pandemic. And partly in function of this national associations and trying to stimulate new national associations to be founded. And then we have the Conference for National Associations. And the Conference for National Associations, Miami was the first one, so it's the only one that's really got a European Union massive presence. But all of the others, including even Nova Gorica, where at the end of 1922, you know, they've got a lot of people from a lot of areas. So this seems to be another bringing in of B and C countries, right? Oops, I just gone past That's the B and C thing. So again, you see no other ISA conference that's regular, the National Congress is basically presidents of the associations or the representatives. No other Congress has this profile of things, and it's a Congress of serendipity. You meet people all the time and you get things moving, and it's a really, really interesting thing. You know, and I interviewed quite a number of people about this. When organising conference of national associations, they'd each end up talking about the same topics, but in different national contexts. I mean, it's absolutely that, you know. And so you can see the University of Sociology, and with that I finished, okay? There was some challenges, but we'll leave that for others. So that's a little part of my report. I mean, it's going to be quite a lot longer. I had some problems during the period I was doing it, so I got behind schedule. So that I apologize to the ex-presidents about that, and of course to the public, but that's life. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really, it is again more another piece in the puzzle of the history of ISA. So now it's time for discussion. I called TK Oman, our dear president of ISA from 1990 to 1994. He is an emeritus professor in Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. TK, you have the floor. Yeah. Hello. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Please.
Yeah. Greetings from faraway New Delhi. I regret that I cannot be present there physically, but I hope you understand my. Several attempts have been made in the past to situate the discipline of sociology in terms of its spread and participation through International Sociological Association, ISA. We have just listened to two of the latest such attempts by Gisèle Sapiro and Tom Dwyer. We are grateful to them for their painstaking work. I've gone through both of them as carefully as possible. Fortunately, there is not much overlap. The comments made by Magdalena Skoloweska of USSR in 1984 is perhaps the greatest compliment to our organization. And I quote, ISA is no longer a gentleman's club of West Europeans only. Having recognized it, let me make three brief comments because I have only 10 minutes. The size and participation of ISA vastly vary in terms of the member countries. Out of 193 listed countries of the world by the United Nations, only 2 have a billion or more population each, India and China in that order. 93 countries are with a population of 1 crore or more, but less than 1 billion. 95 countries have 1 lakh or more each, but less than 1 crore. And 3 countries have a meager 1 lakh or more population, but less than 1 crore. Given these huge disparities in their population size of the 193 countries, we cannot but take cognizance of their vastly different sizes while comparing them in terms of their presence and participation in the ISA. So far, no systematic effort is made in this connection. I hope in future we will take care of this. Although, as I have already recalled anecdotally, that the ISA members, we can be justly proud of the fact that the association's participation has increased substantially since its inception, both in terms of gender and geography. We have managed. We need to analyze the level of participation in terms of the population sizes of the member countries of ISA. Not simply the dichotomy of the West and the West as it stands. If equality of the participation is our objective, you need to take into account the population sizes also. My second point is far more vexatious and which has methodological and conceptual issues. If the first point is about merely the size of the units of analysis, the second point relates to the formation of these units. The tripartite division of the world, the first, the second, and the third, is very much present in the analysis available so far. And this happens partly because of conflict between polity and society of the units. As Bowman reminded us in 1973 and sociologists, they quote, society is used by all sociologists, regardless of their school loyalties, is a name for an entity identical in size and composition with the nation state. Unquote. And I want to remind you that in the process of nation state formation, 3 types of colonialisms were involved, but only one has been. And this, I think, is a very serious problem. The first type of colonialism was the internal colonialism invoked by Michael Hector in 1975 in the context of building the first nation state in the world, namely Great Britain, consisting of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We have a British sociology. We have a Scottish sociology. When France was declared as a republic, identities such as Alsatians, Basques, Catalans, Corsicans, Flemings, and Occitanians were absorbed generic French identities. These are just 2 examples, and several in terms of homogenization of the society going on. Past, many, and it is still present in my own country. The multilingual and multi-religious polities are trying to homogenize their societies, and that's made a lot of problems. The second and the third types of colonialisms are replicative and retreatist colonialisms, and I have drawn attention to them in 1991 through a paper published in Current Sociology ISA. Under replicative colonialism, the colonizers go to new areas and replicate their cultural society. The new world, consisting of the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand, is a product of replicating. The Andean advance in the Indian subcontinent is also an instance of replicating. But nobody refers to these colonialisms. Only retreatist colonialisms, which led to the European states' withdrawal from Asian and African continents is recognized as colonialism, social analysis. This is a serious limitation and ought to be rectified in the course of tracing the history of ISA. The three colonialisms conjointly impact on ISA, but differently at different phases. This should not be ignored. The third and final point I want to make is that there is a tendency, even in the two reports we just heard, while talking about the history of ISA, to overemphasize quantitative. Broadly speaking, there are three fields of knowledge. First, those disciplines which study only matter, which is capable of only reactions. The material sciences belong to this. And those disciplines have made substantial progress in quantitative analysis. The second field studies both matter and life. I call them the life sciences, wherein the possibility of quantification is less as compared to the first, because the objects analyzed are capable of responsibility. The third field studies matter, life, and the human dimension conjointly, and sociology belongs to that field. The objects studied here, that is, human beings, are capable of reflexivity. Therefore, the possibility of quantification is even less as compared to earlier. We are all members of ISA, but we are also citizens of our respective states and nationals of our particular nations. Competing loyalties of our membership to our states, nations, and professional associations often create complexities in our responses to these entities. To generate and analyze quantitative data in the behavioral patterns is nearly impossible because humans are the objects of conflicting responses as citizens, nationals, and professionals may complicate quantification of. I hope in future this will be kept in mind. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so. Thank you so much, TK, for this very important point you raised. Alberto, are you with us? Alberto, can I see the Zoom? How can I see the? Yeah. Hi, Alberto. So, so glad that yes, Alberto Martinelli with us. He is emeritus professor at University of Milano, and he was our dear president from 1998 to 2002. You have the floor for 10 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. The connection is a bit unstable, but I hope it will stay. Well, good evening. I congratulate Sari, the executive board, the program committee, the local organizing committee, and all the participants for this very interesting Congress. I had a chance to follow some of the sessions, and I found them of a good scientific quality and very interesting. Two very short comments on the two reports, and I express my appreciation to both Gisèle and Tom for the detailed, accurate, perceptive account they gave of this long history. A few comments. On Tom, on the financial question, I wouldn't exaggerate the financial problems of ISA. The Vice President for Finance have always expressed their concern, but we have always managed to solve the financial problem. I just want to underline the need for a continuing search for additional sources of funding. This was the way, the method I followed in order to implement what I consider one of the best achievements of my presidency, that is the International Laboratory for PhD students. When I took advantage of additional funding for financing not only the staying, but also the travels for sociologists coming from developing countries in order to try to cope with this major problem, which was at the time and still is, although at a lesser extent, the participation of women and young sociologists from the less developed countries of the world. A second very brief comment on Tom, the China question. Here I just say that when, as president of the International Social Science Council, together with my colleague, the president of the Ecole, it was the Council of the Association, International Association of the Natural Sciences, we had to face the same problems. We found a solution. If you want, I can share it with you, not now because limited time, in order to have a full participation of Chinese sociologists without having the block by our Taiwanese colleagues. On Gisèle, I have to say that looking through the very detailed history of all the 19 congresses, now 20 with this one, I'm really convinced that the ISA played and continues to play a very important role in world science, in the world of knowledge. And I think that this is due to the fact that ISA has contributed to create a real world community of scholars capable of contributing to face the major challenges of our time and to be a very active voice in the public space. That is, that set of institutional sites, universities, the media, lecture halls, and increasingly, of course, internet, in which public opinion is formed and it shapes the political will according to the rules of democratic public discourse, by which all views are subject to the scrutiny of public reasoning, to the critical reasoning of others. This has been a constant concern of sociology, even more than other social sciences. That is, the concern with the relationship between social research, political practice, public policy, between positive and normative theory, from the forerunners like Saint-Simon and Comte to the classics, Weber, Durkheim, Pareto, from Linz, knowledge for what, to Lazarus for the use of sociology, and to the more recent debate, which saw several of us involved in it, Michael, Viviorca, myself, Kalun, and many others. And I think that there are several ways I will just very briefly point out the major ways in which sociology, sociological research can contribute to face the basic challenge of our time, as it is very well demonstrated by the theme which has been chosen for this Congress: resurgent authoritarianism and entanglements of religions, economies, and politics. A first major way is maybe less apparent, but very important. And it is educating students to develop the capabilities and skills required to become public researchers, experts, officers, professionals in many fields, but first of all, to become responsible citizens of open democratic societies, conscious of both their rights and obligations. I think this is a major role that sociologists play all over the world with different degrees of difficulties, because of course, to contribute to developing the critical mind often runs into the worries, the preoccupation of both market and state actors. Certain authoritarian institutions are against it. And for this reason, this is a task that we must continue to play with the utmost seriousness. A second relevant role that sociologists can play in the public space is producing knowledge for describing, interpreting, developing analysis of social phenomena by developing rigorous concepts, analytical models, methods. And in this respect, one can hardly deny that at least in countries where an established social science communities exist, and we heard from the reports that this takes place in many countries, one can hardly deny that the innovation of sociological concepts and the broadening of sociological knowledge have raised the level of public debate decisions and oriented policymaking on a number of important contemporary social issues of the local, the national, and the global agenda, such as migrations and multicultural society, sustainable development, climate change, welfare and inequality, security, peace, research. Third major way, sociological work can help assessing priority issues of the public agenda, often working together in a role of advocacy of collective movement, of critical collective movement. And this can be done and is done often in alternative to the version provided by decision makers and the mass media. In authoritarian contexts, scientific opinions can be more easily disregarded or silenced. But even in democratic advanced industrial society, where the cultural and political life has become more and more mass media oriented, academic intellectuals face a growing number of competitors in the public arena. Journalists and politicians are increasingly the ones who shape the form and content of public discourse. And here the work of serious sociological research can be of great help. This role is closely related to another role we can play as sociologists, which consists in speaking truth to power. That is, clarifying to the larger public complex issues and their implications, unmasking taking for granted power relations shaping social life, critically assessing power holders' policies and ideologies. Social scientists often produce inconvenient truth for power holders. And speaking truth to power and participating in the assessment of priority issues of the public agenda can contribute to develop a democratic public sphere as a corrective and counterbalancing force to both market and state. The market has increasingly come to dominate the institutions and practices of public communication through the commodification of information and opinion and through advertising. On the other hand, the state had become increasingly both economically interventionist and manipulative of public opinion. Hence the need to restore a democratically legitimate public sphere, as Habermas argues. Epistemic communities are key actors of a global civil society and can develop a global public sphere, thus enhancing democratic legitimacy in modern society, both at the national and at the world level. The fifth and last role, and I finish, is participating as experts and also as members of government, administration, and the media in processes of smart governance of complex social problems of contemporary society, together with the members of other similar epistemic communities who do that much more than sociologists, like economists. In independent research institutes, international organizations as ours, in the NGOs, and so contributed to governance of the issues of the global agenda. Social standards should not overlook the risk of such cooperation, such as being co-opted into a policy conveyor belt of the state or providing intellectual export justification for government decision, but they should not renounce to respond to the need of evidence-based policy. They should be involved in shaping agendas, defining issues, identifying options and choices of action, and monitoring impact and outcomes. I think that if we continue to play our role in the line of what has been done within this International Sociological Association, we will remain as a significant voice in contemporary debate, and we will be able to contribute to provide solutions for the basic problems that the world faces today, which are particularly complex, in line and in coherence with the basic values which are at the basis of our activity as sociologists, that is individual freedom, social justice, and human dignity. So long live the International Sociological Association. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for highlighting all these points. So I give the floor now to Pietro Stampka. He is emeritus professor in Jojolinian University, and he was our president from 2002 to 2006. You have the floor, Pietro.
Thank you. Thank you, Sari. I have to apologize for not being with you there at Melbourne, but one does not discuss with the doctors, and my doctor advised me not to take a tremendously long flight to Australia. Instead of commenting directly on the wonderful reports that we have just heard, I wish to share with you some of my perspective, personal perspective, which is of course highly contestable, but I just want to put it forward to you for discussion. I think it is important to debate constantly about the ISA goals, operational ways, and being present at all World Congresses from 1970, 50 years, with the exception of one, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that there is some tension between various visions of ISA. In the remaining 9 minutes, and I have a stopwatch, So don't worry. I will tell you my own perspective, recognizing, of course, opposite or different perspectives, just to instigate some sort of continuous debate, because the fate of ISA is based on debate, on dialogue, on constant formulation and reformulation of its goals and its ways. The first ambivalence is between primary goals. On the one hand, ISA is a scholarly association devoted to the advancing of sociological knowledge throughout the world, as ISA statutes clearly proclaim. This is also evident in the ISA Prize awarded for lifetime contribution to sociology as a science, and not for any different achievements. On the other hand, ISA is the sort of global trade union, representing vested interests of practicing sociologists from various countries, with particular emphasis on those who cannot defend their interests themselves due to the authoritarian or dictatorial character of countries where they work. The second is the ambivalence between meritocracy, recognition of academic achievement as the sole criterion of academic status, and representation, a sort of affirmative action giving preferential treatment to sociologists from less developed regions or various minorities. Of course, it is perfectly legitimate to take it into account in distributing grants, travel allowances, waiving Congress fees, inviting to ISA laboratory. ISA is successfully doing that with the help of the classification of countries into A, B, and C. My point is only that ultimately sociologists should be judged by their contribution to the discipline and not by any extrinsic criteria. For example, the journal International Sociology should strive to reach the quality of peer-reviewed contributions equally demanding and rigid as the most prestigious journals in our profession. And the same can be said about Sage book series, which should observe the highest standards equal to most prestigious publishers in the world. It deserves it. Last but not least, the acceptance of the papers at world congresses should be much more competitive. To give the floor to everybody as a kind of benevolent gesture on the part of ISA is not the road to build the prestige of the association. I have put forward my own position on this issue in the electoral slogan at Brisbane, excellence rather than balance. Even though the climate of opinion in ISA ranks has been far from that, and in the second round of elections, my opponent could not have made more clearly his opposite position, entirely opposite vision of ISA. Nevertheless, to my surprise, I have won the ballot, probably in the secret ballot, without the bridle of political correctness. Most delegates shared my point of view. The third ambivalence is between the fact of unequal contribution of various countries to the pool of sociological knowledge and education, whatever its historical origin, and the egalitarianism, following the pattern of the United Nations, where biggest and smallest countries have the same weight. Science is a hierarchical enterprise. It develops at unequal pace in various parts of the world. We know there are great universities, mediocre universities, bad universities, and universities by name only. And similarly, we know that there are countries where science flourishes, others where the achievements are secondary or derivative and not original, and still others in which science is still in its cradle. It is a historical fact that sociology has been born in Europe, then migrated to America, came back to Europe, and presently is still dominated by Euro-American sociological communities with English as the dominant language of sociological discourse. One should not blame sociology for the sin of origins. To claim that there are some countries developing indigenous sociologies which are equally valuable but invisible and unknown only because suppressed or excluded by Euro-American hegemony is the resonant ideological manifesto, but it doesn't have much to do with realities. Yes, there are indigenous specific problems in various parts of the world, different worries, different grievances, different tragedies of genocide, wars, or terrorism. Sociology tries to diagnose, explain, predict, and hopefully eradicate them. But it does it with the same intellectual tools, the same box of methods all over the world. Sociologists in Ghana work in the same way as sociologists in Norway. And only because of that, we can understand each other and cooperate with colleagues from more than 100 countries in the ISA framework. As I have argued at the first conference of ISA Council of National Associations in Miami, there is one sociology for different worlds, rather than many different competing sociologies. Closely related is the fourth ambivalence between the universalism and particularism of standards of research and theory construction. On the one hand, the standards outlined already by the Big Five, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Simmel, and Mead, the giants on whose shoulders we still stand in this long 19th century in which sociology still lives, turned into a paradigm, or if you will, the canon of the discipline, and were then developed in the 20th century by the next generation of giants, Parsons, Merton, Goffman, Giddens, Bourdieu, Turenne, Habermas, Luhmann, to mention just a few European authors. Yes, European and American. Read Western. Spreading then, because of their cognitive strengths and fertility, rather than academic marketing or imperialist imposition throughout the world. On the other hand, there is the claim of the particular cognitive opportunities of post-colonial populations or global south, and expecting from them radically new ways of research, new methodological approaches, and fully original theoretical insights. It is the echo of Marxist perspectivist epistemology, where it was proletariat who held the torch of truth. In my debate on this issue with Michael Barraway on the pages of Contemporary Sociology, he gave me the nickname of the last positivist, and I reciprocated in kind by calling him the last Leninist. Finally, there is a more general ambivalence, which in a sense subsumes the earlier four. This is the ambivalence of science and politics. On the one hand, persistent research bringing us closer and closer to understanding human action, social structure, and social change. And on the other hand, political and ideological commitments on behalf of certain constituencies serving their particular interests. I guess it is now clear where I stand. Michael Barraway's label is quite right. I am indeed a positivist, but not in the sense of naturalism and naive replication of sciences of nature, but in the sense of affirmation of science as an autotelic value and seeking knowledge as the calling of a scholar, at the same time defending against the inroads of politics into our discipline. To paraphrase Max Weber, if scholars treat science seriously as their vocation, they should leave political biases like quotes in the cloakroom when entering lecture halls, and for that matter, Congress venues. And as the practical, important imperative of applying and using sociology for the betterment of human condition everywhere, I believe that there is nothing more practical than sound empirical knowledge and good theory. In that sense, I am indeed a positivist. I only can hope not the last one among the ISA members and leaders. Thank you. Nine minutes, 58 seconds on my watch.
Thank you, Pietro, for this very provocative critique of ISA, and I am sure we will have to come back to this for discussion. So I give now the floor to Michael Barraway. He's our president from 2010 to 2014, and he's not yet to be emeritus professor. He is in a threshold between limbo. In limbo, yeah, this was the word I'm looking. He just retired from University of California. Please.
Thank you. Sorry. Hello, can hardly see you, but yes, I got 10 minutes. God, Piotr, you're right in front of me. You know, it's a pity you're not actually here. You know, the old days we would have a real wrestling match on the platform. Yes, you and Alberto and Michelle, but now we're only seeing you on the screen. Anyway, it's nice to see you. And it does show, Sari, that actually we're taking note of your presidential address, that yes, we are disagreeing. ISA is probably a great place actually for actual disagreements to be taking place. There's a long history of it. And I would argue that is why ISA has been so progressive, because it had so many wonderful conflicts. But anyway, I'm here to, as we all are, to comment on these two magnificent reports. And I just want to say that I was really impressed by both, that I'm impressed by all the work that went into them, but also the enormous progress that the International Sociological Association has made, whether we think of it in terms of its size, the number of individual members, the number of national associations, the number of research committees, and whether we think of it in terms of the movement away from the UNESCO to become more independent, whether we think of, actually in the old days, I think it was Emmanuel Wallerstein in the last ISA Congress was basically presenting the image of the old congresses as an old boys club, a probably old white boys club. We are no longer an old white boys club, I am glad to say. We see progress in terms of the introduction, not just of the Congress, but of the forums. We see the development of new journals, the International Sociology that was brought into existence by Margaret Thatcher, e-symposium, global dialogue, many ways in which the newsletters, discussions, journals in the RCs, technology has been transformed. It is extraordinary that we can actually hold this Congress in a hybrid form. When I was president, I was having conversations with people, how can we possibly bring in people from the global south, or indeed anywhere in the world, who just simply can't afford to come to these congresses? And I was thinking that we, and others were thinking too, how can we actually make it possible for people to actually watch what's the proceedings without actually being here? At that time, it didn't seem feasible, but now it is. So that's how, again, the digital world has actually transformed the character of the ISA. And of course, it is now much more inclusive than it used to be 50, 60 years ago. And the themes of the Congress have also changed, reflecting the ways in which sociology actually sort of is engaged with the world beyond. Yes. We have a wider membership, and presidents come from different parts of the world. Congresses are in different places. We've expanded, well, yes, English is, as Tom was saying, is a problematically, but at least we have this universal language. But he is absolutely right that some of us have a very privileged relationship to that language. Yes. And I should also like to say that the presidents have made their contributions, perhaps not emphasized in the reports as much as I would have liked. Margaret Archer, I just said, started International Sociology, started a new journal. Emmanuel Wallerstein had a great impact in as much as he developed these regional seminars that generated so many of the young leaders then of the ISA. Alberto referred to his own PhD laboratories, another wonderful innovation that has stuck. And Margaret Abraham started the new junior and senior colleagues discussions that we have at every Congress now, all of which are really important institutional innovations. And I'd like to say that we have grown through conflict. It has been the conflict, and boy, for those of you who haven't been on the EC, believe me, the EC is a terrain, it's a terrain of intense conflict, and it is very disturbing to experience it. But I think it's been through that conflict that the ISA has indeed grown. And I love the way we have elections here. You know, in the American Sociological Association, we have elections that are based on individuals voting. Of course, that would give a huge bias, as we've seen from the figures, to those coming from Europe or the United States. And that is one reason why we don't do it. But the way we do it here, we have the elections here, and there's all this campaigning and talking and gossip. It's really a wonderful experience. And we hear and participate in, or at least some of us do, in the actual direction in which the ISA goes. Yes, yes. You know, Tom, you in your report, I was delighted to emphasize that you emphasized the importance of the ISA office, that little office. How many square meters did you say? 40? 40 square meters, where Isabella Bolinska has run the ISA for nearly now 40 years. I think this ISA would not exist the way we see it if it were not for Isabella Bolinska. I think without her, we probably would have bit the dust. She knows many of us. I'm always amazed when I sit in front of her at the registration desk, see all the people who come. She knows exactly who they are, where their background, as well as, amazingly, their names. Her role has been crucial. Her role has been crucial in keeping the ISA on track. When we're about to fall off a cliff, she drags us back from the cliff, very quietly, invisibly, but does so. And she pushes the agenda of the EC. And she's very careful, which is very crucial. And I don't know if Cecilia Delgado Molina is here, but it's very important that she doesn't get involved in the struggles that go on in the EC, but she is there to keep the whole thing afloat. I cannot repeat this too often, how much we owe to her. Yeah, and my last point, I can't resist, is China. Tom, you said you were not giving a policy statement, but you did. You were proposing that, and importantly, proposing that actually China be brought in. How can we leave China out of the ISA? how can it be not recognized as a national association? Because of course Chinese sociologists can of course participate in the ISA as individuals. Yes, and you also noted that a number of us have, former presidents and vice presidents, have tried to tackle this issue. I spent much of my time as vice president of national associations doing shuttle diplomacy between Taipei and Beijing. And my conclusion was, but well, it so happened, first I remember talking to, it was Li Pilin, who was head of the Academy of Sciences in Beijing, and I said, you know, how are we going to resolve this problem? And he said, it's unresolvable, and he just laughed at me. So I went to Taipei and I said, well, we're trying to think about it. They were very, very concerned that if indeed China was recognized as a national association, they, the Taiwanese Sociological Association, would not be able to survive as an independent organization. And it was clear on both sides that this was irresolvable. And I'll be very interested to know what Alberto's solution. The Olympic Games solution is to call Taiwan Taipei City. I think that was one of the solutions in the past. But anyway, I think we have to be very careful in bringing China in as a national association and not push Taiwan, throw Taiwan under a bus. They have been so crucial for the fruitfulness, for the flourishing character of the ISA. When we suddenly can't hold a conference in Kazakhstan, who volunteers to hold the conference? There was a National Association conference. Where? Taipei. And when they run conferences, they are amazing conferences, and their participation in the ISA has really been so significant and important. So I hope that we will think very seriously about the stance of take into account the stance of the Taiwanese Sociological Association as we move forward into this very delicate arena. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think you raise issues to be discussed, I'm sure. So our last speaker, Margaret Abraham, professor of sociology, not emeritus, not yet retired, great, in Hofstra University in New York. And she was from 2014 to 2018 president. Yeah, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I know we have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible. First of all, I just want to say I'm pleased to be here today, but I also want to take a moment to just say that we do miss the presence of the late Margaret Archer, our first ISA female president today, and it'd be interesting to see what she had to say about all this discussion. Thank you, Sari, but thank you, Gisèle, for your illuminative work, your reflections and analysis of the ISA history of sociology through discussion of the ISA World Congresses, and Tom, your work on the ISA and presidents, as well as the operations and the data there. There's so much to comment about, and there's a wealth of information and analysis that you have brought in preparing these reports. However, given the limited time, and knowing that I was invited here to comment, I'm going to try and comment on the papers and some of the issues, and recognizing that my colleagues have also shared their perspectives already, I'll limit my comments to some aspects. Now, I saw in all these presentations, but also the idea that there are certain common threads in your presentations, as well as in the reports. And one of them is this idea about, Gisèle, in yours, about the role of institutionalization, internationalization, transnational and globalization of our discipline. And you note that while frameworks, national frameworks and methodologies have circulated prior to the formation of ISA, clearly over the years we have seen that ISA has played an important role in the production and the flows of sociological knowledge and in the circulation of people, ideas, and networks, be this through conferences, projects, publications, and especially in the last few decades, as you note, it's been much more inclusive. The project has been, however, over a period of time. I think attention to the ISA World Congresses through analysis of the themes, topics, foci, conference backdrops, levels of participation, forms of engagement, countries and regions provides a sociological lens on some of the histories of our discipline. However, including the hegemonic and counter-hegemonic forces that have shaped and challenged at different points the forms of institutionalization and internationalization. The history and analysis through a historical periodization, Gisèle, as you referred to, does provide some understanding of the key sociological foci and the contestations across sites and time that contribute to what I consider and I've called a contextual global sociology. Now, I'm just going to mention a few of the threads and then move on to what I think is important here as to comment upon, and that is of gender. So in terms of a few common threads through the historical periods and also what, Tom, you note, I will hone on a few of them. Situating sociology, you know, it's an important part of why, who, how, and what is entailed in situating sociology. And these come out in the reports, particularly in the analysis of the congresses. Be this in discussing sociology as a science or not, talking about the prevailing conceptual frameworks, dominant theories, methodological debates, tensions in the flows of knowledge production and circulation of ideas. Who decides? For who? How? And what spaces and contexts does this occur in? And what are the contradictions, contestations, and connections that the ISA brings? And I think the ISA does bring some of this. We see there are considerable binary opposites and dichotomies that are often put forth and which have been challenged and contested by, at different congresses and by different speakers. We've seen the contributions that have shown us through immigration, inequality, coloniality, post-coloniality, inequality. I know Piotr doesn't like some of these terms, but they're there. Neoliberalism, violence, law, and structures and agencies. So that's one of them. The second one was on the emphasis throughout, the emphasis on teaching, research, and practice. Clearly, the ISA had a role to play in this, and it continues to play in not only the forms of participation, but how we have flows and exchanges of what should be theory and what should be practice and how we bring those connections. There has been an increased role of the ISA in bridging, connecting transnational networks, especially through the formation of the NAs, the national associations, regional associations, research committees, working groups, and thematic groups. Also, the role of sociology in teaching, research, and practice. However, as we think forward, we will have to examine in the future what it means in terms of the changing terrain of education with the shifting levers of control and what this means for the role of ISA, whether this in populist governments, authoritarian so-called democracies, and more. The third common thread that I saw in both, Gisèle, your work, as well as yours, Tom, was about funding and funding flows. Funding and forms of participation and engagement, its politics and impact. One of the things that come out time and again is the analysis from the very beginning is the role of funding, both the sources and the need for funding for ISA, but also how the funding priorities at times shape what gets undertaken and what projects get undertaken. I was quite fascinated by that in looking at some of the congresses and what was discussed and how it was funded, and the different presidents speaking about that. The forms of funding, whether it's UNESCO, Ford, membership dues, governments, universities, what kind of projects should be funded, who the ISA offices, how the ISA office is supported. Funding flows and capacity to hold congresses. What is also interesting is how funding flows, especially in the early years, determine the priorities and also the impact of the sociological participation forms of inclusion. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I think some of the other speakers have spoken about. And then there are three others before I talk about mine. One is about the idea of globalization and the challenges of globalization. The fifth one is the role of technology and mobilization, how technology has been used and shifted the way we look at both the circulation, the knowledge production, but also the circulation, and how this has been set up in the ISA. Michael Burawai talked about it, and I think played an important role. We did this through GMS, often it's said as yes, an ISA initiative, but it was initially a presidential initiative, and the ISA has played a very critical role, including Izabela Barlinska and Convex, and the ISAEC at the time. And then we have this idea of attention to violence that was brought up. Time and again, we see the theme of violence in many of the congresses. And perhaps this points to the importance of addressing violence in our world and its implications, but also the important ways in which we can talk about gender and intersectional violence too. So my main point here, and perhaps I felt it was important to do it as one of the women presidents, but not only for that purpose, also in terms of the conceptual frameworks and the contributions that women sociologists in the discipline, outside of the discipline, and in ISA have contributed. One of the important ways we've seen this, both in your reports, but it's also kind of fascinating how valuing knowledge and production, mobilizing against erasure, marginalization of women in the discipline, profession, and association, and the move to ensure greater inclusion in leadership, increased participation, the recognition of immense contributions of research, teaching, and practice. You both address this, but I really think that the history of the ISA needs to examine this more closely, because when it's not documented and when it's not communicated, there is a kind of ghettoization of gender and the contributions in terms of gender. What is abundantly clear in Gisèle's analysis of the World Congresses, which I hope will be further reviewed in further detail, and Tom, on the association and presidents, is that it's been a long, very long, winding uphill road to acknowledge and recognize women's sociological, intellectual contributions, organizational labor, contributions to theory, policies, practices, linking research and activism that have been pivotal to building, sustaining, and ensuring the future of ISA and our discipline. And I include Izabela Barlinska in this, who has played a very important role. This also, of course, means engaging in the discussion that challenge the dominant structures and cultures that assume inclusion compromises or reduces intellectual rigor. Michael and I were both put in the period of inclusion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it subsumes, or that because you have inclusion that you don't have intellectual rigor. So perhaps including women's intellectual contributions and organizational contributions will make a difference. ASA, yeah, suffers from some of this. So in going through your reports and presentations, it is very clear that most of the congresses were male-dominated, and both in framing intellectual contributions and positions in the organizational structure. I just want to take one example, which I think is really important. You all mentioned it, and I felt it was important to make a note of it. 1970, Varna, the Congress, which had the title Contemporary and Future Societies, Prediction and Social Planning. It was the first time that a Congress was held in a communist country. And there's a huge discussion, which I think is fascinating in terms of how the discipline was framed, the inclusion and exclusion, who participated, who could not participate, who decided not to participate, and who was prevented from participating. Some of these same issues have come again at a later point in time. The Congress was held in a time in a communist country, and the nature of who participates in this Congress are discussed. However, I want to end by saying this was actually also another very important historical moment. This is actually a very important moment, as it was here at this Congress, if I'm correct, that the lack of gender inclusion is questioned and mobilization occurs through the form of a petition. The genesis of RC 32, one of the largest, if not the largest RC of the ISA, has its genesis from the working group with the same name, Sex Roles in Society, that was established in this Congress. And it was the petition of these women and men at this Congress that has made one of the important moves. So I'll end by saying that today, when we think of these key moments, we should include in an important way the gender and intersections in the history of the ISA and Congresses. It's an important movement for multiple reasons, and I hope you'll find out more. And with that, I will end. I want to just say there is a lot of hope and a lot of possibilities for ISA, and we will have conflict and will have differences, but however, a part of that dialogue and debate leads to progressive change. Thank you.